Hello, you're listening to Queer Everything, a queer of color podcast about thriving in the world while being at odds with it. I'm Lena Rafiq Sheikh. My guest today is Bushra Rehman, the author of Roses in the Mouth of a Lion, which came out from Flatiron Books in late 2022. It's about a Pakistani-American teenager named Razia growing up in Queens, New York in the 1980s. It's a fantastic book. Not only was it a compelling queer coming-of-age novel, it resonated with me deeply for reasons that I'm sure will be obvious if you've been listening to the podcast. In addition to Roses in the Mouth of a Lion, Bushra is the author of 2 collections of poetry and a novel called Corona, as well as the co-editor of a collection of essays by women of color called Colonize This: Young Women of Color on Today's Feminism. She also offers a wonderfully named workshop on writing autobiographical fiction called Two Truths and a Lie. I loved hearing Bushra talk about the book and how formative it was to find queer community of color at a certain time in her life, and how this shaped her as an artist, and about how disobeying the urge to write is a betrayal of the soul, which is so quotable. I'm going to make a promo clip out of that. Bushra's warmth and expansive way of thinking and being and her generosity really came out in force in this interview, and I just love being in conversation with her. Welcome. Hi, everyone. I am thrilled to welcome Bushra Rehman, the author of Roses in the Mouth of a Lion, a coming-of-age novel that's set in Corona, Queens, which is up for multiple awards, including the Gotham Book Prize and the Lambda Literary Award. Bushra, thank you so much for coming on and speaking to me.
Thank you. I've been loving hearing the podcast. It's such a beautiful labor of love, so I'm happy to be here.
Beautiful. So I really loved your book, which is why I reached out. I was struck by it and touched by it in multiple ways. And I have a number of thoughts and questions and reflections.
Yeah.
First, before we get into the questions, I'd be curious about your process of coming to it, like coming to writing a coming of age novel specifically.
You know, ever since I was a little kid, I wrote in my diary. And, as this is a queer Muslim podcast, I will say that, as a young child, I felt like my diary was the only safe space. So I was always just writing in my diary, writing my thoughts. So writing was always a part of my life as a way to survive, a way to heal, a way to cope, a way to just know my true inner self. And so for me, this from that young 10-year-old who wrote in her diary to this now almost 50-year-old who is writing a coming of age novel about a girl who writes in her diary, it just seems like I had always hoped I would finish this book in my lifetime, and it is, yeah. So, and I love reading coming of age novels. I love reading. And so to me, it just means a lot to be able to add a book to the repository of human libraries.
I love that. So for me, this was the first time that I'd read something where I understood all of it, including the Urdu that you didn't translate. And, as I was reading it, there were a number of phrases that I, imagined people who don't speak Urdu struggling to pronounce, things like dupatta, supara, all the food words, right? And I actually really appreciated that. And I'm curious about that as a choice and how you were thinking about audience when you wrote it.
Yeah. And, I have to say that when you just introduced me, we never went over the pronunciation of my name. It was music to my ears, the way you just perfectly said it, like someone in my family,
I mean, I have cousins. I have a cousin named Bushra, yeah. So,
well, I should say I came to writing very early, and I was sharing my writing publicly in the 90s. And in the 90s, I was mostly reading at fundraisers for the South Asian Lesbian and Gay Association, for the South Asian Women's Creative Collective, Women X Creative Collective. For Desh Pradesh, which I don't know if people are familiar with this. So there was at this time in the 90s, all these underground, mostly South Asian, not heavily Muslim, I'll say. I was often one of the few Muslim people or only Muslim people on the stage. And I think that, so there was this way that who I have always been writing for from the beginning was first for myself and then for those communities, and so I would be putting in only things that we would know. So even though now my work is, being read, in a larger platform, forum audiences, like the people who I'm still writing for, like you, Lena, or I still would want to get on a mic at a Salga party and, you know, I, and have it be all these inside jokes. I'm writing for us. And I often feel when I read books that are written, that are, about South Asian characters, and there's a lot of explanation or, italicized words or whatever, I'm like, oh, well, they are like me, but they're not writing for me, so
Right.
I always want to be writing for us. And I hope to always do that.
I have to say, it made me really, really happy as a reader.
Oh,
And
good.
and I also caught like little details, like the doily on the appliance,
Yeah.
right? Like, so I really appreciated that.
Oh, so fun. Yeah. I used a lot of family, a lot of photographs, a lot of, to kind of recreate, especially because it's basically a historical novel because it's from the 80s. It's about being Muslim and queer in the 80s,
Yeah. You're making me think now, right? Because like the thing about the doily, I was like, oh my God, like there was a photo that I picked up, a Polaroid, right? Taken in Pakistan. And there was one of those stand-up radios, right? With like a big doily covering it so that you couldn't use it. But like there was a doily on it.
I wrote poetry mostly, and like the first poems were literally about those VCRs and doilies and the way my mom would make illegal bootleg copies of Bollywood movies that she would sell at my uncle's audiovisual store. And I was like telling someone about that, and I was like, you like these things, these technologies are so precious and expensive that you would cover it from dust and treat it like it's not like we're just like throwing bringing our iPhones to the bathroom and dropping them in the toilet. It's not like that, It's just like you were like, this is a precious, very expensive thing that I must cover with a doily,
Right, exactly. And it's hilarious.
Yes.
Yeah. So, in a similar vein, there were also a lot of themes that resonated with me in the novel and also in what in this, brief conversation we've had so far. Like I used to lock my diaries up as a kid, right?
Yeah.
And some of these themes are universally queer and some of them are deeply culturally idiosyncratic. So the strategy like the surprise ask or generally framing things in ways that would make it hard for the adults to say no, even though presumably a lot of people are up to something very different that, you're covering your motives about. Or
Could I
like
explain what the surprise ask is? Like,
please explain what the surprise ask is. Yes.
So the thing that this character Razia wants to do is basically just hang out with her best friend, and she's not sure. Like, if sometimes her mom is starting to think this best friend is like a bad influence, and so she won't let her hang out with her. So she's always thinking of like strategizing ways her mom will let her get to hang out with her best friend, who is also Pakistani, who is also Muslim in the community, but still, like, Razia is growing up so protected, And so the surprise ask is like, should she ask her mom ahead of the weekend if she can go? Or should she wait and just surprise her mom at some random point in the weekend when her mom seems overwhelmed and will be like, yes, please go to the Slima's house, So yeah, so there's always a constant strategy of like how to manipulate. And the diary becomes an important part of the book and as it progresses. And so I knew at some point the editor was questioning the role of the diary in the book, and I was like, no, this diary it's all about the diary,
Interesting. Yeah. Without giving too much away.
Yeah, we don't. I'm also trying to be like, don't give away too much.
I think we did skip a step, which is like, how do you frame what the novel is about for people?
Oh, yes. Okay. So it's called Roses in the Mouth of a Lion. It is about a queer Muslim girl growing up in the 80s in Queens, New York City, in a under-resourced neighborhood, working class, all immigrant from around the world, because Queens, New York is very much like that. Thankfully, still is very much like that in many ways. And so she's, she doesn't know she's queer. She's, and it's the 80s, and like even George Michael's in the closet, Whitney Houston's in the closet. There's no internet, even the
No
books that
internet.
are being published, no internet. Even the books that are being published are, like just to find a queer character, even in a work of literature. So she's just feels different all the time. And I really was very interested in capturing what that difference felt like when there were no words for it. And because she's very spiritual, like she has friends like in the community who they basically just go through the motions of being Muslim just so they don't get into trouble. But Razia really is like a believer, and so it's in her diary and in her du'as after her namazes that she, talks to Allah and shares her feelings. I mean, all she knows is that she does not want to get married. She doesn't want to get, she's not very like, she doesn't want to wear pretty, quote unquote, pretty things. So she's just always seen as different, and her friends kind of tease her about it. But it's not until she leaves the neighborhood, because the whole schooling system in New York City is like, there's a lot of things that could be improved. But, one thing is like she leaves her neighborhood to go to a school in Manhattan, and it's a world away, Queens to Manhattan, it still can be a world away, when she's young, she's I think 14 or so. And when she goes to this other school, it's like the first time she's with people who are not from Queens. And she meets a young girl who's Greek and Italian, and they end up, beginning, I don't know if I'm sharing too much now, but this is in the book jacket. Something blossoms between them, let's just say. And then it just kind of goes from there.
Even in your description right now, so much of what you said resonated. I spent those years in Pakistan, and there's the theme of getting out. There's the theme of this sense of a foreclosed future if there's no movement out, right? So I don't know. I would have loved to read something like this when I was that age. I think that would have opened up worlds for me.
Yeah, I really hope that this does get into the hands of young people. I mean, I'm going to guess be very serious right now but I just think I'm just anecdotally hearing about just like the rise of suicides among Muslim Americans. And I think it just goes hand in hand with the fact that like now a lot of masjids are preaching about, and being homophobic and transphobic. And I think that there's like, when I was young, like just nobody would ever talk about it, but I was a suicidal teenager, because I thought that there was no hope. Like there was, my life right now is so amazing and wonderful, but like, I remember very clearly just being like, and I don't think that necessarily the character is like that in the book, but she's not me. But I think that, when you feel like, I guess the only way I won't get married is by dying, like it's just like and in my family practice arranged marriage too. So, so I was always like, I guess I just have one option. So I really hope that this book does get to a lot of young people. It's not being like marketed and sold as a young adult book, but like, I really hope that young people do find it.
I mean, there's at least a couple of people from our community that I'm going to make sure know about it. Young people specifically. And I have a similar motivation for starting the podcast, right? Just putting material out in the world for, that I wish had been there when I was younger.
Yes. I mean, I was listening to the one with your friends from your affinity group, and I just related so much to so much of what they were saying, and I think especially with it being Ramzan, and I want to do this, I'm trying to kind of connect with other queer Muslims, because I think it's it's an intense month for us. It can be.
Yeah. So speaking to that, I thought you offered just this amazing portrait of somebody growing up in a deeply religious community and, really resonating with some of it and being at odds with also a lot of it. And I thought you captured with this character this wonderful skepticism and also way that she just needs to navigate the world around her, right? Where she has to like accept things and also be even while she's, skeptical of them. I'm curious what your process was around creating this character.
I mean, I think that I am of an age, I'm old enough now that my relationship to my faith and spirituality keeps evolving and changing. And I think there were definitely, I mean, as a child, I was extremely religious and I a true believer, you know. And actually my parents still think that like nazar lag gayi, you know, that's why I am the way I am now. Because I was like too good, you know. I like finished the Quran by the time I was 7. I read like every
Right.
namaz without being told. You know, I just like I really just was into it, you know, but I do think that for me it was because Allah was someone who I could talk to openly. And there was no one else in my life I could really, really talk to openly like that. Like I had a lot of friends and, you know, we would be silly with each other and we would talk, but just like my really deep stuff. So that was all about, that all happened during my namazes, you know? And I think that, you know, my parents were just, you know, really amazing people. And it seemed like their faith really was their system that they were following to be so strong and amazing, you know. But of course I had like I had my lost years, you know, where I didn't do anything. And then when my father got very sick, I wasn't praying at all, wasn't reading namaz, wasn't reading Quran. And when he got very sick, I was like, you know what? What is this like pride thing I have? Like, let me just read namaz, you know, to give him some kind of peace, even if I'm just reading it like there, you know. And as I started to read namaz and again, you know, I was like, oh, right, I forgot. Like, and, you know, I remembered like, I just remembered all the prayers.
Comes back,
Like,
yeah.
it comes
Oh,
back
yeah.
so fast. It's
Yeah,
so
yeah.
like imprinted in my brain. And even my mother was like, "Namaz suno wala mi, how do you still know it even?" And I read it, and then they both were like, "Oh, damn, she does know it still."
Yeah.
So, you know, because they know that I don't, you know, they knew I
Yeah.
didn't practice, you know. And so I started to again when he was sick, and then I do feel like I just have this like, it's been a gift to me because I feel like I'm reconnecting to parts of Islam and my idea of what spirit is and what life is and what soul is very large. And I am feel like I'm talking all over the place, but I do feel like my parents like that this life is not everything. You know, I don't necessarily believe in a heaven and a hell, but like I do feel like it's so much more than this life, you know, and how I move through this life is kind of like that. Like I can take it seriously, but not seriously in certain ways because I have that feeling inside me that there's so much more that we do not understand at all as humans.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's also a hard thing to communicate to people in our community, right?
Yeah.
I feel very
Oh,
similarly
yeah.
to you, and I don't really talk about it.
Yeah, I don't feel the need to convince anyone else of my beliefs. So, and that's what makes me very different, yes, than other people in my community. Because I'm like, your soul is so your own. It's like the one thing that is just your own, you know, your soul. And how can anyone else tell your, you know, your soul like what to do? And, you know, the she's very the character is very skeptical of especially the stuff around her place as a quote unquote woman, her, you know, the rules around it, the unfair ways that daughters and sons are treated. So, you know, she sees the injustice. And, you know, the thing about what I, of course, realized once I left my Muslim community is like the patriarchy is everywhere. And like, you know, white Americans are just as patriarchal and, you know, women are really mistreated and so that's really what the mouth of the lion stands for, which people will get to at the end. But and I think that's why the book, my first actual book, this is my 5th book, was called, it's a book I did with my friend Daisy Hernandez, Colonize This, which is a book of, I'm the co-editor. It's like 28 essays, and we did a new version in 2019 where it's just women of color writing about their experiences as women in their different communities, you know. And just to show that it's like, this is not something like, it's not just Muslims who are patriarchal. I know that in the West, that's what people want to think, but it's like patriarchy is everywhere. And all people of all genders can participate in it, you know? So it's something that the young Razia doesn't know, but there's seeds of it that are kind of planted of like who she might kind of grow up to be.
Right. So that gets to one of the questions that I had for you, which is, I really appreciated what you put on Instagram a little while ago. It was from an interview that you did, the Shondaland interview.
Shondaland, yeah.
talking about how I think there's a very easy narrative of like, especially for queer people, right? Oh, you get out and then you assimilate into some other, you know, American, Western, European, whatever it is, right?
Right. And then you're
that's
free.
And then you're
Yeah.
free, which is such a load of
Bullshit.
horseshit. Yeah. So I'm wondering, and you know what? That's the flat narrative that when I talk that people default to first, right? So I have a little bit of trouble thinking about what do I want to share, because how much of this am I going to have to disentangle? So I'm curious about how you think about it and how you have how you think about the more nuanced story that you want to tell.
I mean, so to write a book like this, first I have to just be very cognizant of like the Islamophobia that is just rampant in this country. And I was, born in Brooklyn, like lived in the United States most of my life, except for a few years where they tried to move us back to Pakistan and then to Saudi Arabia. And then we're like, yikes, we'll just move back to Queens. But, I think growing up in Queens, I feel very, very, very lucky that my parents lived in New York City for most of my life. And so like growing up in New York City, like there is I did not interact with white people, honestly. Like, so my US narrative is very different than the narrative of someone who might have grown up in a more affluent way or in the suburbs or however. Like, so I was always amongst people of color, And so my only understanding of white people was like on television. And so I think I did think that they had it better in some ways, but but then as soon as I like left my town, like I was saying in this earlier, was just like, I was like, oh, they're like just as patriarchal. They're like, it's like, what is this? Like the men are watching football and the women are in the kitchen. I was like, this is just like any old Dalit, or just the way that men would still dominate all spaces, And I was like, okay. But I was been so sheltered, that I had to take like I had to take until I was much older until I hung out with white people, although I was growing up in the US. So I think that there is a way that because of how I grew up and because of the kind of books and stories I have also read and the movies of like assimilation as the answer, like I know that that is not true. And I'm also very blessed in that in the 90s I was in BIPOC queer communities, the Audre Lorde Project and with Salga, like we were all BIPOC from the beginning. So I understood always, like we were always celebrating our cultural heritages while celebrating our queerness. Like that was from the go. And I'm just so grateful for the, people of Salga and like people like DJ Rick, who would have like dance parties where we would meet. Like I feel like we were like every few times a week we were just meeting, going out dancing and hanging out and making our chosen family, which many of us needed. And those are still decades later, they're still my family, the people that I met back then in the 90s. And I think I feel very and I think that I do feel maybe there's a spiritual part of me is like I have a certain life and I can put it in a book form so that people who might not have had that upbringing or growing up experience could know that there's other ways to be queer or there's so many different narratives.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm glad I'm making sense.
No, totally. And
Ramzan and we're just like,
yeah, I'm like 30 minutes away from baking fast. So
okay.
I'm a little a little spacey. I'm curious about your journey as a writer. You've mentioned that you've been writing for a very long time. You have 5 books. I was able to locate 3. So I'm curious about your journey and also about how things have changed for you, other writers in our community since you first started.
Well, as I was always just writing in my diary, and then I started writing. There was one year where we moved to Saudi Arabia, and I didn't go to school for a year, and I just started writing poetry to keep myself entertained. I was like 12 at the time, and I was writing poetry just gave me a certain joy that the diary writing didn't give. And so again, just doing it for myself, literally like a 12-year-old living in Medina, not interacting with anyone, writing
Medina.
poetry. Yeah. Yeah, my parents were like, if we're gonna go to a Muslim place, let's go to the most Muslim place.
Wow. I grew up in Riyadh. I know what Medina's like.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole other lots to unpack there, and I think that what it was that let's just say that there was a moment in the 90s where I went to a place called Saki, which is like a DV place for South Asian women in Queens, and I was going to find a lawyer for someone that I knew, and like a pro bono lawyer, and to help someone get out of a marriage. And so then the person was like, okay, here's the lawyer. And then they were like, well, what about you? What do you do? And I was like, I don't know. I don't do much. I work at the bookstore. I write poetry. I think at this time I had already kind of separated from my family at the first of a few disownments. And then the person was like, oh, there's a meeting tonight for this group called the South Asian Women's Creative Collective. And at that time, that's what it was called. And again, like, divine timing, like it was like that night, and they gave me the address and I walked into that room, and it was just, and this is the way that like, I think my queerness and my art have always, and my activism all have always been just like all together, because, I walked into that room and it was just filled with like queer South Asian. And then they were like, oh, well, do you want to share some work? And so I started sharing work, and then they were like, we have a fundraiser. Would you read poetry at the fundraiser? And I think the very first time that I went on stage and read a poem, like I didn't even know I knew how to do that. Like I didn't know that I had abilities like that where I could just get on a mic and share a poem and move people. And once that happened, it was just all over. And I was just doing open mics and, just open mics all over the city, other fundraisers for like Salga and other places. And then I think I met my friend Daisy through another feminist organization, Women in Literature and Letters. And Daisy asked me if I wanted to co-edit Colonize This, simply from just hearing a few poems. And then Daisy and I did Colonize This, and the writers in Colonize This inspired me to put my own story together. So I worked on the stories for Corona, and it was really impossible to get it published. And Corona was eventually published after decades of trying by a small queer independent press in Arkansas, Sibling Rivalry Press, which is an incredible press. They also published my first book of poetry. But I was always writing. I was always reading. And this last book is the first one that started out with one of the main publishers. All the others were like with independent publishers or self-published. I made like a little chapbook of my poetry that I used to give out to people. And so I'm very much about like, especially when I hear about writers and they ask me about publishing, my first question is like, well, have you written a book yet? Because I feel like, and then they're like, well, not yet. And I'm like, well, then just, do the writing first. Writing always comes before publishing, because when you write and when you make writing community and when you're out there sharing your work, every publishing opportunity I've had has kind of come through community. Anything that's gone right for me in terms of a writing quote unquote career is, and I am a working writer now, but I think that it is something that was a whole journey, a meandering journey. But for me, always it was about the writing and helping other people write now too, because I feel like I've learned a lot about how to get through writing blocks, how to shape things, how to structure things. And so I do them every so often, like just writing classes for queer BIPOC writers and allies. I used to do it at community organizations and cafes, and it's just very affordable, class or barter or whatever, so it's just something I love to do. And that's a way to keep building writing community. Yeah. To me, it's so much about, it's always been like from that day one, when I walked into that room of this amazing community of artists, to that's just was always the way that it's been, and I hope it to keep being.
Beautiful. So the question of writing workshops is something I've been thinking about lately. I've been in more, not even traditional, but business as usual workshop spaces very long time ago. And there's a reason that I've avoided them since. So
Yeah.
I'm curious about how you think about the space that you offer.
Well, the space I offer is very influenced by the spaces that I was part of. One shout I want to definitely give for they don't exist anymore, but they were called Women in Literature and Letters. Writers Angie Cruz, Marta Lucio Adelina Anthony, they started this, and I think they had gone to traditional MFA programs and were like, this is some bullshit. Like, just all the kind of racism and classism and
Right.
homophobia and transphobia, everything that's like being revealed has been revealed. Like in the 90s, these three women were like, we are just going to start our own workshops and we're going to create this set of rules, which are very supportive and very meaningful. And so I literally have the facts from when I was in there, and I still follow those guidelines, and they're very basic guidelines about how to give critique. And they are, about only positive things in the beginning. The facilitator has a very important role in keeping all the feedback constructive, never telling stories from your own life, when you are giving someone else feedback, always using the narrator instead of you, because a lot of people are writing about very personal things. And as soon as you create a person, even if they're inspired by you, they are not you, they're a character and they're a narrator. So I just am constantly, I've taught for decades in lots of community settings and with children, and I teach a lot. I work a lot with children, and I think that helps my adult writing workshops also be very playful, because all the things I have to do with kids to make it fun and playful, I do that with adults, and then they're like, this is so much fun, So I do think, and one of my workshops, and this is what I really miss from pre-pandemic life, is we would have and it was all, queer BIPOC people, where we would have a 2-hour workshop and then we would go hang out for 3 hours after every single class. And, I miss that, I miss those hangs, because that community building is as important as what we're doing in class. I mean, you need to have both. It can't just be all hang out at the bar. It has to also be sitting down and writing too.
You started a little bit talking about advice that you have for young writers. And particularly, I'd be curious what you would have to say to young BIPOC writers.
Well, I think just as for writers, for queer writers, BIPOC writers, queer BIPOC writers, I would just say, again, create a community, whether it's just on Zoom, where you just meet together, you share writing that you love, you set a timer for 20 minutes and just write. You give each other writing prompts. There's all kinds of writing prompts, and poets and writers, and all over online, you can always find, or if anything, you just find a poem you really like and choose a line from it and go, But I find that it is really helpful to do that in community, especially if you feel like you're having a hard time getting started. And then, be very generous, be kind to other writers, help other writers, because it's by helping each other. I really feel, and I think this is why the publishing world is changing, because as writers of color, we do need to help other writers, because we all rise together, And so there is this idea that we rise together. And I think this comes from queer activism and activist spaces, this understanding. For me, they've always been all together. And, the main question, because the class I teach is, it's about writing memoir and autobiographical fiction. And I do have, people can find it, or maybe we can link to it. It's advice I gave to people who are afraid of writing because they're afraid their families are going to disown them, right? Which is the first question. I always just try to get it out of the way in the first class. And then I wrote an article about it, because I was like, Claire, just read this, we'll just get to the writing in class, because it kind of captures that, when we're afraid to write, first of all, we are holding on to secrets that are painful and toxic. And you never have to show that writing to anyone. It can be just for you. Not everyone is driven to go like this on a paper, or not everyone. If you feel this desire to do this, you are a writer. You have this trait in you. And if you do not honor that, you're betraying yourself, you're betraying your soul, because you might be afraid of this person being mad or that person being mad, but your own soul being mad at you, that is the worst thing. You don't want that. And I also think that sometimes when people are afraid of airing dirty laundry or family secrets, there's always the option to write under a pseudonym. And actually, I want to hook you up with this writer who wrote Hijab Butch Blues.
I would love an introduction. Yeah.
Oh, yes, I will do that after. I'll do this today because, that is a pseudonym. It's an incredible book and they're writing, under a different name. So you can, sometimes people wonder, like, in this world of social media and whatever, like, how can you do it? And it's like, you can, you actually can. But because I'd already been performing in public in so many ways before this, and because I'd already been disowned multiple times from my family, like I felt like I am in this place where, and because I built such a strong chosen family, like I felt that I could bear the brunt of being public, very public in my life. But I follow safety protocols. Like I follow safety protocols where I'm constantly, making it impossible for people to find me. We have to be very real, right? We have to be very real. And I will say one of my favorite writers, Edlin, has said, when people get mad about what you wrote about them, it's like, well, you're the one who did that thing.
Yeah.
I'm just writing about it. So if you don't want anyone to know about it, then don't act that way.
Don't do that.
Then don't do that.
That's great.
And sometimes it leads to like conversations like, my family and I were grappling right now with the publication of this book and, right on the foot of, the passing of my beloved, my father, who I loved very much and was very, very special, spiritual, beautiful, generous, kind person, so, and then this book comes out at the same time. It's kind of a wacky time, but my mom and I are starting to have conversations that I think I never could have even imagined, possible. And, I have no idea if I'm even going to go home for Eid this year because it's going to be like, who knows what's going to happen. But, it's not easy. And that's why you really do need to have chosen family. You really, I have if I can't go home for Eid this year, which I know is one of the most painful things, right? You could say as a queer Muslim, like I am reaching out to my other, queer Muslim friends who also can't go home for Eid this year and see like, what can we do, And yeah, so I think that those are just some of the ways that I've tried to survive. And I think it's a blessing, the kind of life that I live right now. It's not always easy, but at least it's like, I'm making it up with all the mistakes and whatever. Obviously it's not just me. I don't feel like I have that much power. I feel like there's a higher power and divine things that are happening that I have no control over. But yeah, I do think that this was something that I was meant to do. So when you feel like you're doing the things that you're meant to do, there's just a joy that's hard to explain.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I'm aware of the time. And
yes,
I do not want to
and
keep
I hear the writers laughing downstairs.
So Bushra, thank you. Thank you for coming on here and for talking to us. Just want to mention that. So yeah, no, really, thank you.
You can find Bushra on Instagram as @writerbushra, and I've also linked the article that she mentioned in the interview as well as her book down in the show notes. Follow her, read her book if you haven't, and share it with the young people in your life for whom it might resonate. I'm doing just that. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.